We are not saying he's the best. We're just saying there's nobody better. Brendan Dorman is back on OFT. Brendan, I miss your face.
What up, fellas?
How are you?
What's up, man?
I'm doing well. Post St. Patty's.
Yeah.
Let's rock.
The hangovers are illuminating. We're going to do something different with Brendan. We normally bring Brendan on to talk about fights that have happened or are about to happen. But we're going to do reading Reddit this week with Brendan involved, because there's a couple of posts that are interesting. And the one that Rob pointed out and we want to dive into is the rate of submission victories in the UFC from 93 up till today, and how different it is.
Yeah, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it on the screen now, and you'll see that the rate has dropped significantly. So we're going to talk about why that is and just bits and pieces about that topic.
Yeah, okay. So, Brendan, I think in a way it's an obvious question in some ways, the early days to now, why submissions maybe not as effective. But, you know, we let you answer that. Why is there not as many submissions today as there was in the early days in mixed martial arts and UFC in particular?
I would assume the obvious would be jiu-jitsu's not new at this point, right?
Yeah.
So the really early days, if you go back to the mid 90s or whatever, or even late 90s, someone like Hoist Gracie, or I guess you could use any of the Gracies, Hickson for Pride 1. A lot of that stuff was new. Sakuraba kind of threw a wrench in those spokes in a way that, like, say, Ferguson is now. Like, they're getting submissions, but not in the atypical way, take you down, pass your guard, submit you. The thing that I was thinking of, too, is that two things are kind of new. And one is submission only. That's relatively new as far as grappling tournaments. And the other thing is where the innovation has come from in that realm, right? So a lot of things like De La Hiva, if you know who the Miao brothers are, Berimbolo, like a lot of like ankle lock things, and, you know, basically like people locked in 50-50. None of that stuff, I mean, some of it can absolutely work in MMA in the right context, but it's tough to pull off. Yeah. And in these submission only tournaments, which are progressive, and I think they're a step in the right direction. As far as grappling, there's still no strikes. So to go inverted and things like this, where people are getting submissions and said, you know, EBI rules, let's say, you know, and I know he's trying to do like what is he calling it, combat jiu-jitsu or something? Where they can do like palm strikes. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I didn't watch it, so I don't know if it's goofy in practice, but it's good in theory, you know. I think that's a lot of it, and I think people are kind of more savvy to submission now, and there just hasn't been a whole lot of innovation since, you know, the inception of the UFC as far as like what submissions, right? Yeah. So like Ferguson, for instance, from scrambles lands Darces. Jeff Glover was doing that in submission grappling or whatever, just grappling in general in 2006. You know, it's not new. It's maybe new in context. But like the whole Danaher Death Squad, and obviously I'm a fan and friends with those guys and all that, but a lot of that stuff's not really going to translate, you know? Even someone like the great, you guys know Marcelo Garcia, I assume?
Of course, yeah.
He's probably the best pound-for-pound submission artist ever in grappling. Yeah. And he did one MMA fight and he was out. So sometimes with the gloves, without the gloves, might change it. There's so many X factors. But I also think takedown defense has gotten better. Yeah. And you've seen the rise of the super athlete, and some of them come from wrestling. Yeah. Tyron Woodley's a good example. When I was looking at some of those stats that I tried to send you, I guess the link was broken, about like takedown defense. Tyron Woodley's is like 97% or so. It's insanity, whatever it is. We saw it with Maya, you know.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to look at the actual graph, because I think one of the lower parts, apart from now where it's getting even more lower, and I think that's probably just because, as you said, so many fighters are getting so much better at defending takedowns, so the fights just don't hit the floor as much, so there's obviously less of a chance of a submission. But if you look at where there's kind of a dip, like a real dip, it's like mid-90s, well, not mid-90s because whatever, but between 1995 and 2000, and that's kind of the rise of the wrestle boxer almost. So you'd have the crazy super athletic wrestlers who just wouldn't be taken down, and if they were, they got really savvy at defending takedowns from the guard, or defending submissions from the guard.
Sure. Randleman, Coleman, Randy Couture a little later, and then Liddell, right? So, yeah, absolutely. That's a good point.
Yeah.
And if you consider the era, and Chuck, you figure Chuck's prime years were what, early 2000s? Ish?
Yeah.
You know? And that was all about sprawl and brawl. And no one really uses that term anymore, but there was a guy who understood wrestling, and he used it to keep it standing. Kind of like Aldo was a really good jiu-jitsu practitioner and used that to have fantastic takedown defense, you know? Woodley, much the same, you know? So I think that's part of it. But I think people have, you know, I think the submission grappling element and what people are using in jiu-jitsu versus in MMA and gloves and all of those things, I think all of those are factors to consider. I don't think it's an absolute anything, you know?
I think
it's fascinating to me
as well. We had the new breed, we're talking about Liddell, but even when you still looked at like the Liddell era, I think there was a lot of fighters that were, you know, still one style of fighter that was doing a bit of jiu-jitsu or had a bit of wrestling in the back pocket. While when you start getting into, like, I always famously remember that they sort of really pushed Rory McDonald as the first real mixed martial artist. He didn't train jiu-jitsu or come from a taekwondo background. This guy just trained mixed martial arts. So I think that it's almost the most obvious point to say that when this sport came together, it was different. It was almost like Anchorman, you know? It was like Channel 5 would come along and go, hey, we want a piece of this action, and that's jiu-jitsu. And then, like, you know, the Spanish channel would come, and that was like boxers, or, you know what I mean? And that's almost like how MMA came. Everybody came into this meeting point, but now it's evolved. One of the couple of interesting things I found, though, throughout, just looking here, it's an article. It is an old article, but I can use it because I'm talking about the early days. In the first 7 years of UFC, the most used submission, if you had to throw a guess at what was the most successful submission, Brendan, what would your shout be?
Armbar.
Ooh, armbar is just second by 1% or one submission.
Triangle choke?
No, the number one at the time was a rear naked choke. Yeah, rear naked.
Okay.
And that's sort of...
I figured because the way you asked it, I wanted to go a little. Rear naked makes the most sense, though.
But like armbar and rear naked choke seem to be side by side when you go down through the years. So rear naked choke at the time was 24%, and then 25% moving on from up to 05. But rear naked predominantly took over. In 2006, the rear naked choke was 37% of all submissions. Which is you know, it's a large number. Yeah. But then this is where I start meaning like we involved a lot more then. But at the same time, the evolution of this sport, the number one was the rear naked choke still. The biggest year to defeat it was 2009, where the guillotine had the most success outside of the rear naked choke. Now there's another section that just says other, and that's everything from anacondas to darts to key locks to knee bars. But predominantly the rear naked choke has been number one for the longevity of the sport.
There's a reason for that, I think.
Yeah.
Like
do you guys know how to apply a rear naked choke?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, how many setups do I have?
Yeah.
I don't know. I can't count them. But arm bars, you know, I don't love arm bars. And the thing is if you're in mount in today's game, with the way it's scored and everything, you're almost better to strike than to try to arm bar, even from full mount. Yeah. You don't see people laying out for arm bars. They'll try them from the ground off their back, you know, or they're throwing up their hips, but never from a top position. Yeah. And that's kind of fascinating too, because a lot of what Hoist was doing was that he was submitting people off his back with triangle setups and stuff, and people didn't know how to even defend arm bars or triangles at all really back then. You know, nowadays you see everyone they know hitchhiker escapes, etc. Sorry, I cut you off.
Yeah, just on the rear naked choke as well. If you watch somebody who's very inexperienced in grappling, the first thing they'll do when somebody is grappling them is to turn away from them and try to get away. And if you watch the early MMA fights, the early UFC fights, a lot of it's somebody trying to pull away, trying to get away, and the first thing they think of in their head when they're inexperienced is, let me get away from this guy, I'm going to turn around, and then it takes the back. We did find this on Reddit. You can see on the corner, up in the corner.
Just before you move on. Sorry, moving
go
on.
ahead.
The question then, Brendan, and I know this is a weird one because you're going to, in a way, I'm asking you to, I'm not asking you to take away some of the victories or some of the submissions, but clearly, an obvious question or an obvious answer for me then, it's a lot more impressive if a guy of today gets a submission over a guy of today as Hoist Gracie tapping somebody out back in 93, 94.
Of course.
Like,
of course.
And
yeah, because everyone's privy to it. Like when you saw Damian Maia, when he did it to Condit, you were like, whoa.
Yeah.
Because Condit's very ground savvy.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, who have you done it against?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? All of that counts.
But what I like about it as well now is when you look at the fight just happened a couple of weeks ago and the whole crowd jumped and got excited when Ortega got a hold of Edgar's neck.
Yeah.
And it was still like, oh shit, you know, and that was still like, oh, here we go. So I love that it's still there, but I don't want to take away from what obviously Hoist Gracie done for mixed martial arts and jiu-jitsu as a whole.
I didn't even take it that way.
But I think it's more impressive now. If you get it like an incredible submission in this era of MMA, it's a lot more impressive than it was 15 years ago.
Well, it's like me tapping a white belt versus me tapping a purple belt.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a first day person. I mean, they're annoying in a way because they don't like. It's the video game analogy we use, right? Yeah. They're just pressing all the buttons and going crazy. And you're like, Jesus Christ, can you relax a little? I gotta set this up.
My point.
You know what I mean? But at the same time, as soon as they have like a stripe or two on their white belt, then they at least know some defense, and it's everything's progressive.
Yeah, I find as well, I don't know, I think striking, from what we've seen, striking is, I think getting offensive and becoming better offensively, striking, I think is easier than being defensively sound in grappling. Like, I think it's easier to defend a takedown than it is to get really proficient at getting takedowns or getting submissions, where I think, like, working on defending takedowns, working on defending submissions is a little bit easier, in my opinion. That's how I felt anyway.
Sure.
So, I misunderstood it. It's easier to practice defense than offense. Is that what
in grappling, I feel it.
Okay.
Yeah, but in striking, I think a lot of people get better offensively than defensively quicker.
Yeah. Well, I think that's because
I think there's a reason for that, because when you spar in grappling, it's kind of day one, right? But in striking, if you have a good striking coach, and if any of my experience as a coach, like, it's always like kind of pad work, shadow boxing, bag work, light sparring. Like, there's a wicked progression to your striking before it's even live, let alone with takedowns involved. That's the last step, you know? So you're not even really striking a opponent that's coming back at you until, you're well along, I guess.
Yeah.
You know? Whereas jiu-jitsu day one, you're live sparring.
Yeah, exactly. Just from Reddit, I'm going to read out a couple of comments because there's some interesting ones here. Along with this graph, there was another graph which showed the decline in other methods of, say, like in knockouts or in decisions. And what the graph showed was that there was a decline in submissions, but there was an increase mostly in decisions. Somebody said here, seeing that the TKO, KO have trended fairly flat, it's clear that it's the decision victories that have eaten away at submissions. This makes sense in the context of sport, as the average level of wrestling BJJ skill has gone up, and even strikers have at least introduced some submission defense into their training. So that's interesting that we see that decisions are the biggest mover. So it seems like a lot more people are winning decisions, and then the submissions are going down, which makes sense.
Well, yeah, in a way as well, though. Like, that's almost it almost complements what we're saying about people have learned to stop these takedowns. So now the skill sets are more, again, the video game analogy, or a trump card. Remember trump cards? Yeah. It's like, you know, my score might have been like 20 back in the early days, but now I'm on par with you, like 70, 75. So if I'm efficient enough in being able to stop your takedown, that's probably the grappler's way of winning the fight. So if I become proficient in stopping it,
instead of getting,
you might beat me if you've out-grappled me for the 15 minutes of the fight, but I might be proficient enough to stop you submitting me. So yeah, that seems to make sense.
Yeah, 100%. And you referenced like Rory before. I always think of, and he didn't start in MMA the same, but his teammate George was kind of the first completely well-rounded guy.
Yeah.
Especially when his wrestling became his wrestling, right? Because Matt Hughes couldn't get him down. Josh Koscheck, no one could get the guy down, but he could take you down at will and jab your face off, right? So his striking was good, and his background was in karate. He was a Kyokushin black belt before, I think, when he was young, and he learned wrestling, which is just incredible. And I'm not going to go on a tangent with that, but Rory, and now you see it with DJ, even I mentioned Condit earlier. There's so many TJ Dillashaw. All these guys are rounded. You know what I mean? They can do anything, really. That's the new game. Minus like maybe heavyweight. Most people can kind of do everything pretty well and maybe have one thing that kind of stands out. There's only a few specialists left.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I think one of the early ones that was very well rounded as well was Nick Diaz.
Yeah.
Like Nick Diaz,
is super, but no wrestling.
Yeah, super jits game.
Yeah,
and like he could stand and bang, and I love this pop style of striking. But yeah, Nick Diaz,
great to watch. Just no takedowns, no American style wrestling. You know,
I have two interesting comments here, which kind of reflect each other. So WFD said strikers have a huge advantage because they have gloves and wraps to protect their hands. They can throw strikes against the head as hard as they can. There was an article several years ago which said the KO ratio skyrocketed after fighters started to use gloves. And then just leading on from that one, whereas gloves make grappling harder, it would be interesting to see how different some fights would be without the gloves. Especially BJJ would probably be a lot more effective, you'd think. Makes sense. Grappling does make it. The gloves do make grappling a little bit harder to get chokes and to get certain submissions.
Like for the what the hell's going on there now? But for me, the gloves, like 4 ounce, yes, they protect, but you're not gonna like. You look at the amount of fighters that have injured their hands, like broke their hands.
But still punches hard.
No, there is, but the 4 ounce gloves aren't as forgiving, you'd say, as the bigger boxing gloves.
But they're still very forgiving
compared to nothing.
The one thing I always say though.
No, I gotta interject a little bit. Your hands are wrapped. It's not about the glove. It's about your hand being sturdy. So when you punch something hard, let's say someone goes to slip a punch and they bob in and you hit their forehead, right? Your hand is gonna go like this. And you're gonna hyperextend here. It's not about your breaking your hand as much as it is you'll throw with reckless abandon because your hand's wrapped. Think of it that way.
But even just the pain, like I always say to people, like to see how much a glove protects a hand or even a wrap or whatever, is punch a wall just slightly without a glove and then punch it with a glove. You're not going to punch it a second time without a glove, but you will with the glove. So
absolutely. Yeah, it's a great point. And then gloves are just in the way. Like think of like if someone's tucking their chin and you're trying to slide through, but all of a sudden you have all this like extra padding now over it. Like that's a lot harder to kind of pry someone up. You know?
Even like wrist control and stuff. Like wrist, like you're not allowed to pull the glove, but you're allowed to hold the wrist, and the glove is there.
A fight we spoke about, regional fight here, Brandon. I want you to watch this guy's jiu-jitsu game. He's only a young kid out of here. I'll send you a link for it. Lee Hammond. But Lee was fighting Jack Monaghan out of Cork, and at one stage it was happening right in front of me, and Lee all but had the choke wrapped up, but his hand was like, because of the glove, what we're talking about, his glove was sort of stuck in between his arm and his body, and
it's clamped.
So his hand would he ended up getting the choke and getting the hand out. I think I explaining as he's slithering his hand out, but if that glove wasn't there, his hand just comes through and just locks up the choke. But remind me after this to send you Lee Hammond, because I think you will be ultra impressed with his jiu-jitsu. Phenomenal. Only a young kid.
I love watching good jiu-jitsu. It's beautiful.
So,
like, think about this, guys. When you watch jiu-jitsu on, if you watch like a Marcelo in his studio, or like if Henzo doesn't show as many live rolls from his place, but any type of jiu-jitsu competition, right? When you see someone lock up a rear naked, it's usually full scissor. But a lot of times in MMA, you're seeing like one hand's around, and they're just fighting to get this hand clamped to it, and you'll see them just go palm to palm and kind of get everything from there, rather than slicing, you know, and getting real deep on it because of the glove. It's not. You only have to watch both to understand that. There's a reason, because someone can keep grabbing at the thing, you know.
So the
that makes perfect sense to me.
The question is with this, we move on to something else in Reddit then, Rob, unless you have other comments. But the question with this is, so we've noticed, because of the skill factors, we find that it's sort of quite obvious that fighters are more equal than skilled, so they may not be as good at offensively stop or getting submissions, but they've certainly got a lot stronger defensively. Will that decline in subs keep going, or have we reached a level where the masters like your Ortegas, your Damian Moyes, your Demetrius Johnson, who have all this, like Gunny Nelson, these guys, will that still keep a playing field, or a certain, like, will that graph at the moment stay on the line it's at, or will we see that lower again?
based on
That's
based on
tough
the
to
trend
say.
line.
I think because submission grappling is still kind of relatively new, especially like the EBI rules.
Yeah.
I think we could see it increase. We could see. I could see a reason for both. You know, it's really hard to say. Because it's like, remember when I was explaining that for a knockout artist, sometimes I think we were talking about Ngannou, and I kind of mentioned like a DC or a Khabib or something like that. It's harder to do that. It's harder for Damian Maia to implement his game than Ngannou.
Yeah.
Ngannou's just waiting for an opening. Maybe not even. He might hit you when you're blocked up, and he might put you into, onto one of Saturn's fucking rings. But a submission artist has got to work, and throughout that work, Woodley Maia being a good example, you're not winning any points. You're not scoring at all. So, I could see it declining for that reason. But because there's more submission grappling, just more people doing jiu-jitsu, I think, in general, you might see an increase too. Both are possible. I'd probably go with the decline, though.
As an add-on to that question, do you think we've seen the last of some submissions? You sort of said armbar, that people aren't going to take that risk from a mounted position to spin into an armbar. Like, he'll kill me for saying this, but Chris Fields, an Irish fighter, notoriously said on a show that nobody gets triangled from guard anymore. That doesn't happen in MMA. His very next fight, a couple of weeks later, he got triangled from the guard. Now you've seen Paul Craig throw up a triangle from guard just this past weekend with the home run.
Left,
but do you see a decline in a certain submission? Like, do you think we've seen the last of? Is there a move that if you get caught now, it's like, man, I can't believe you got caught in that?
No, because Ferguson hit Lee with a nice triangle, and he set it up differently, and that was the whole trick. I don't know if you saw my breakdown of that, but there's something that he did that's like just a minor tweak, and it's kind of a hat tip to Eddie Bravo, really. Like he looks at jiu-jitsu like, I probably look at striking. You know what I mean? It's not that I'm incompetent. I'm certainly competent completely, but there's some people that are just so innovative. Like what John Danaher knows about jiu-jitsu, or Renzo or someone. That is 1,000. It's 1,000 times what I know. It's not even close. And it'll just be different setups. Like people don't use arm drags, for example, in MMA, but there's a reason, because you're dropping your hands.
Yeah. So
where that's really effective for, say, Marcel Garcia in a grappling context, it's not going to be, in an MMA context. So you don't see like Americanas a lot, or did you say key lock for it earlier?
Yeah,
it's the same submission, just different nomenclature.
Yeah.
But you don't see many of those. But that could be gloves again, because you got to sneak one under.
Yeah.
But no, I don't. Because Darces are coming. You see a lot of Darces now.
Guillotines from
Triangles
guard.
from the back. You still see them.
Guillotines from guard, I find you don't get them an awful lot. Like you get guys getting them standing and pulling guard, but like actual guillotines from guard where they're in guard and you just pull a guillotine, it's very rare.
Very rare, because they're hard to do from guard.
Very, very hard.
It's one thing, like from a closed guard anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
You know what I'm saying? And a lot of people try Armins, and most people do them wrong. I happen to learn it from the guy that kind of, I don't want to say invented it, but at least made it prominent in Renzo.
Yeah.
And there's tweaks to that. Arm and guillotines are very hard to pull off. Yeah. So that's part of it. No one really goes high elbow. If they were doing that, you don't even need a full guard to push their hips down, because it's a spine crank at that point. And by raising your elbow, you're blocking their trapezius from, going around you for like a Von Flew,